Good afternoon. Okay, I'm ready to start class. I hope you are. Is everybody back from spring break? Did you all make it back okay? Did you have a good time? Well, okay. Whatever. Now, I hate to start on such a downer note, but you do know that the next essay exam is a week from today. But do not be worried. Tonight I will post a study guide. And Thursday night, Ian Green will be offering, as he has offered before, a test prep session. And you'll be receiving information about the when and the where of that. So, if you've kept up with your reading, then you should be fine. And if you have thought about, I'm going to do the study guide a little differently. Instead of just pointing out, you should have read this, so review this. You should have read this, so review this. I'm going to raise some issues that if you haven't thought about, you need to think about. So, if you haven't done the reading, then you'll have a hard time getting prepared for the exam. But, you know, that's the way it goes. We all make choices in life. Do you have any questions? No questions at all? Okay, well, completely changing the subject today. This first political parties is just a reminder of the 1790s and the issues of the 1790s, which is when these two political parties emerged. Now, these two political parties are both in place in 1800 when Thomas Jefferson is elected president, and that's known as the Revolution of 1800 because Federalists have held the White House. Not that Washington and Adams identified themselves as Federalists. They most assuredly did not. But followers of, say, Alexander Hamilton, he identified himself as a Federalist, certainly identified those presidents' policies as Federalist policies. So, those two parties are still in place. But Jefferson gives a rather remarkable inaugural speech. He says in his inaugural speech that he wants to list the essential principles that will guide his administration: equal and exact justice to all, support of the states as, I'm quoting, the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. And another essential principle is absolute acquiescence in the decisions of majorities. Majorities rule, period. Supremacy of civil order over military order, a reduction of government spending, honest payment, that's in quotation marks, of public debt. I don't understand that. He's concerned that some dishonest payments have been made for the public debt. Freedom of the press, freedom of the person under the protection of habeas corpus. And he ends, this is really rather remarkable, he ends this inaugural address by saying, after all, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And he was the arch enemy. There's almost not a single Federalist policy that was supported in the 1790s that Thomas Jefferson really agreed with. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. But he's trying to unite the country. Now, the interesting thing about his presidency is that as president, he functions quite pragmatically. And most presidents, in terms of being president are sometimes a little different than what some of their supporters might have expected, because, you know, they have to do the real thing, and it's a little more complicated than anybody would have anticipated. Well, as president, Thomas Jefferson, there was no large-scale ousting of Federalist-appointed officials, but as Federalist-appointed officials retired or left their positions, they were replaced by Republicans, which is what anyone would expect. Federalists in 1800 not only lost the presidency, they lost Congress and the executive. Well, they lost Congress as well. And they hoped to make, the Federalists hoped to make the judiciary, the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court, a bastion of Federalist principles and power. So, the Judiciary Act of 1801, and you know, the election's in 1800, but Adams was still president, and it's not until April of 1801 that Jefferson is inaugurated. Okay. So, there was the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was Federalist legislation, strengthening the federal bench, or strengthening the bench. And Adams made some midnight appointments, meaning at the very last minute, he made some appointments to the bench, and of course they were Federalists. Okay, he gets to do that, but a lot of people were like, hey, wait a minute. Well, the Judiciary Act was repealed in 1802. 2 Federalist judges were impeached. I don't know why. One was convicted. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase was impeached, but acquitted. The Jeffersonians ended all prosecutions under the Sedition Act, which of course you would expect them to do, and they significantly weakened the Alien Act, that legislation, that absolutely partisan legislation of 1798. While Jefferson was president in his first term, he reduced the size of the federal government out of his conviction that the principal care of our persons and property should be left to the states because they are more closely attuned to the needs of the people and can be more closely held accountable. Okay. Well, as the nation grew, and it is growing in population, the question was, would the states be able to adequately and effectively protect the people's liberties? What about oppressed minorities? Now, once again, at this point, we are not talking about ethnic or racial minorities. They existed, but nobody was sensitive at all or aware of their oppression. We're still talking about people like creditors. It was creditors in 1780s who were the minorities in legislation that was passed by state legislatures. And so the question is, well, now here we are in the 1800s with this emphasis on absolute majority rule. Is there some group that's going to get screwed because they're the minority but they're not popular? Some people were worried. So functions of the federal government under Jefferson in his first 2 terms were, as he believed they should be, reduced to foreign affairs, delivering the mail, and dealing with Native Americans, and administering the public domain. Now, Thomas Jefferson talked quite a bit about political equality. What was important to him was political equality. Now, he did believe that one should own property in order to be eligible to vote. He did not differ with his confrères about that at all. So, if you're not going to, if property is still, you got to have property to vote, then how are you going to increase political equality unless you also increase economic equality to some degree? Well, Jefferson's hope was that more and more people would move west into the opened up Northwest Territory and to territory just west of the existing state boundaries into the Ohio River Valley and so on, and be able to buy property, and that would expand the franchise. And to some extent, that happened. But then, of course, there was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. In 1803, the magnificent Louisiana Purchase that nobody would have predicted Thomas Jefferson would have approved of, because remember, he's the man that believed in order to be really functional, republics need to be small so that the representatives and the represented know each other. They cannot be these large, sprawling affairs. But Thomas Jefferson was very eager to see Western migration increase. Republican laws reduced the minimal acreage for purchase, hoping to increase political equality. But the main thing was the Louisiana Purchase. Here's the background. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte gained all that Louisiana, let's see, where can I go from here? All that Louisiana territory from Spain. Spain, it had been a part of Spain according to the 1763 treaty that ended the American Revolution. All right. Thomas Jefferson sent an envoy to Paris to seek purchase of New Orleans, because when Bonaparte gains Louisiana from Spain, this sets aside, or this restricts American access to New Orleans. So Jefferson sends an envoy to Paris to seek purchase of New Orleans. And he sends James Madison, his old friend, to Britain to talk about assistance in case there is war with Spain. Why would Thomas Jefferson be concerned about war with Spain? Well, you remember, this quasi-war with Spain had been going on in the Atlantic ever since the XYZ affair. Now, it is true that in 1800, John Adams negotiated the Treaty of Montefiore, but Jefferson wasn't sure whether or not he could trust that, so he's concerned. So Jefferson goes to Britain, no less, concerned about, will you help us if there's war with Spain? Do you see the irony in that? Okay. Bonaparte, Monroe, and Robert Livingston, the U.S. envoy to France, negotiate so that the United States can purchase the land west of the Mississippi that, until 1763, look at the map, had been claimed as New France, and that after 1763 was part of Spain's empire in the New World, and that after 1801 was once again French. Now, I don't expect you, I'm not going to ask a question that says, Who owned the Louisiana Territory at this time? It is important to know that in 1803, Spain again owned what had, for quite a long time, been considered the new France in the Western Hemisphere. Spain lost that to England in the French-Indian War. But here it is again, Spain doing deals with France. Did I say Spain lost the war to England in the French-Indian War? Okay, thank you. Let me go back. The Louisiana Territory had been territory in North America that France had claimed as the French Empire, the French Crescent, the French Empire in North America for well over 100 years, almost 200. Not that they settled that territory, but they certainly had built forts along the Mississippi River. They lost that territory to the British at the end of the French-Indian War. Okay. The British lost that territory to let's just stop there. Okay. So, France lost that territory to the British. Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution about purchasing new land. Nothing. I'm assuming that by now you have all read the Constitution. It's a fairly short document. And Thomas Jefferson, you will recall, in the yes?
You said that France lost the land to British. So it was British for sure? Or was it Spain?
In 1763, when the British and the British colonists defeated the French and their Native American allies in the French-Indian War, that territory was British. Now, I think there was a coda to that treaty that allowed Spain to hold on to some Gulf of Mexico territory, Florida. Okay? All through the 1790s, Jefferson had insisted on a strict interpretation of the Constitution. That's why he was so, well, that's why he said he was so opposed to the U.S. Bank. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows for the national government to create a bank. There are other reasons why he was opposed to a bank. You recall those. But he said, you know, we've got to stay by the Constitution. We start wandering away from what the Constitution says, and we'll be in real trouble. And there are people that hold that position today. That position didn't prevail when it came to the creation of the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States is still existing when Thomas Jefferson is president. In fact, while he's president, he even recharters the bank. But back to Thomas Jefferson believes in the strict interpretation of the Constitution, which would probably mean that he is not authorized to purchase territory. Nothing in the Constitution that authorizes him or the national government to purchase territory. But in this case, he uses a loose interpretation, a broad interpretation of the Constitution, and reasons that under the General Welfare Clause, the national government is empowered to purchase territory. So he does make that purchase. And as you know, He then creates the famous Lewis and Clark and their Native American guide, Sacagawea, expedition to map the territory. Now, Federalists were uncomfortable with this. They were afraid that the expansion of U.S. territory was going to significantly diminish their power. Their home base, remember, the Federalists' stronghold in the nation is New England. That's nothing compared to the South, and now there's all this new territory. Are the Federalists going to get New England farmers over there? So, they're worried. Now, in the meantime, make note of that. I'm skipping over this because we've already talked about it. In the meantime, there are these two significant slave revolts. One was successful, one was not so successful. The slave revolt in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, was successful. Yes, this was a slave uprising. They successfully overthrew their masters. Gabriel Prosser in South Carolina maybe Virginia, led a slave revolt and was not so fortunate. It was not successful. In the whole history of slavery in the United States, there would be over 400 slave revolts. None of them were successful. But I mention that to you because it is important to you know. It is important that you know that many slaves were extremely unhappy and angry about the injustice of their situation. Well, after the Gabriel's Revolution it was Virginia, Virginia tightens its slave laws, thinking, we got to tighten up on their behavior so this can't happen again. So Jefferson's presidency proceeds. He's presided over the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the only really unfortunate thing in Jefferson's presidency, and it was indeed unfortunate, was the embargo of 1807 and the unintended consequences, which were devastating to American wholesalers and retailers. I talked about that before spring break. So, Jefferson's presidency ends, and then Monroe is president, and then Madison is president, and read in your text how the party alignments change and how they change names. The Federalists sort of disappear and become something called the National Republicans. And for a short while, there's just one party, the National Republicans. Anyway, the next big story in the story of the political and economic and cultural development of the United States, the next big story is the development, the emergence, the market revolution. In the early 1800s, the United States, not immediately, but over the course of several years and very steadily, becomes a market economy. What's a market economy? A market economy is an economy based on buying and selling. You and I have lived in a market economy all of our lives. We cannot imagine not living in a market economy. And I've talked much, you've read much about exporting and importing. That's buying and selling, yes. But exporting and importing, that buying and selling, that has to do with commerce that is largely centered on the East Coast. That is not what most Americans were involved in. That is not how most Americans made their livings, with the exception of commercial farmers in the South. They were growing tobacco, indigo, rice for sale. And that was a lot of tobacco, it was a lot of indigo, it was a lot of rice. It wasn't millions of people. So here's what, and this is very hard for us to imagine. Very few people in 1800, 1805, 1810 worked for wages. Very few people in those years lived their lives on the basis of buying and selling. Let me try to flesh that out a little bit. Between 1790 and 1820, this is the transition period in the United States between a pre-industrial, pre-market America and the industrializing world of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution in Britain has already happened. The Industrial Revolution in France is already going on. Nearly 90% of the population in the United States in 1810 is involved in agriculture, not commercial agriculture, agriculture. The other 10%, they're involved in the carrying trade overseas. They're involved in the import-export business. In the South, that's staple crop production. In the North, that's livestock and grains. But most of the 5.2 million population of the United States in 1800 lived on farms, small plantations, and in small villages. 1 in 16, nope. There was no city in the United States at that time as large as 100,000. And if you take the 4 largest cities in the United States in 1800 and you put them together, you would have a total population of 180,000. Now you see, we have been talking about the development of the British colonies of North America and nothing but the development of the British colonies of North America. And we have been talking about their development politically and economically. That's all we've been talking about since January. So, and they've won their independence. They've done a lot of things. And so it's difficult to imagine that that doesn't mean there are a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of big cities, but there aren't. Seem like big cities to them, but not by any other standard. And it's very, very difficult for us to imagine. As late as 1815, note this, as late as 1815, most manufacturing, most things that were made by hand or with the assistance of a machine or a tool, as late as 1815, most manufacturing was household manufacture or in small workshops by skilled artisans. Most of it as late as 1815, which is to say, that's another way of saying there was almost no factory production. The factory form of production was extremely rare. As late as 1840, still only 8.8% of the nation's labor force is involved in factory production. 1840. Less than 10% of the population is involved in factory production. And yet, factory production is becoming an increasingly significant part of the economy. So how did this market economy emerge? How and when did we go from this pre-industrial, pre-market, subsistence farm and artisans and bartering economy with some of the carrying trade and commercial agriculture in the cities and on the coast? How did the United States go from that to, by the end of the century, oh my goodness, the factories, the industrial development? Well, a number of things had to change. A number of things had to be in place, or a number of things had to develop in order for this to happen. The emergence of a national economy was the major economic development of this period. And the preconditions for a market economy are attitudes that promote capitalism, the expansion of the population, transportation, financial systems, and government support. Those are up there, aren't they? Yes? Push this up. Okay. Attitudes favorable to capitalism. Well, some of those are in place. I mean, we got the work ethic in place. We got English mercantilism that encouraged trade and so on. But Americans outside of urban centers had very limited opportunities, and that curbed their economic incentives. Some colonists, like northern merchants and southern tobacco and rice farmers, some colonists accumulated significant wealth. But here's the thing. Most ordinary Americans did not, nor did they expect to, become wealthy or to live even better than their parents had lived. But attitudes in the late 18th century, that's the late 1700s. What else was happening in the late 1700s? Attitudes in the late 17th century. No, attitudes in the late 18th century, the late 1700s. What else was happening then? The resistance, the revolution. Those things sound familiar? Yes, the late 1700s, the late 17th century. In the late 17th century, we see, in the midst of all of this turmoil between the colonists and the British soldiers and the British officials, we see a new and expansive economic spirit. The break with England, the American Revolution, and the break with England significantly enhanced Americans' sense of economic freedom as well as political freedom. Republicanism, with its emphasis on the sanctity of private property, buttressed or supported capitalist assumptions. Now, think about that for a minute while I cough. Have you got that, Al? How Republican principles of the sanctity of property buttressed capitalist assumptions? All right. And prosperity at the turn of the century. I mean, things had been really bad in the 1780s, you remember that. But by the turn of the century, things are getting better. And more Americans are beginning to feel hopeful. And there is an attitude of approval regarding individual economic success. And you think, well, of course there is. People are always impressed with people that make money. Well, is that so? Sometimes when people made money, other people thought, oh, that was so showy. There was something rather crude about it. But, I mean, the Puritans certainly did. But at the turn of the century, there are more and more attitudes of approval regarding prosperity and the demonstration of prosperity. All right, so you have cultural mindset facilitating conditions that approve of capitalist enterprise. And then the next thing, Western expansion. The migration of an expanding farm economy. The rapidity of Western settlement and the development of Western agriculture was both a cause and an effect of what historians call the transportation revolution. People wanted to move west because they could afford to buy land in the West, where there was competition for buying land, but less than in the East, where there were many more people and much less available land. So people wanted to move west because they could buy land. They could have a farm. They could be economically independent. And they would begin as subsistence farmers, and then they would grow enough crops that they could sell or export or who knows what. But in moving west, if they get to that point where, okay, we've added enough acreage that we can really, we're growing more than we need for our family. We can sell half of our crop. Then the question is, how are we going to get it to market? Because if you cannot get your crop that you want to sell and make money on, if you cannot get your crop to market, it might as well not be there. You understand what I'm saying? If you cannot sell it, it doesn't matter how many people want to buy it. So, if there had not been a revolution in means of transportation between East and West, between the East Coast and Western settlements, market expansion would not have happened. The market revolution would not have happened. And that's why we say that the rapidity of Western settlement and the development of Western agriculture is both a cause and an effect of the transportation revolution. Okay, let's look at the transportation revolution. In the early 19th century, the transportation networks were very, very, very pitiful. They were almost non-existent. For example, in 1813, land transportation, now listen to this, and look at the map, land transportation along the eastern seaboard from Worcester, Massachusetts, down to Charleston, South Carolina. That's 1,000 miles. Okay. Now, to travel that overland would take 75 days for one wagon load of goods drawn by 4 horses. Now, how can a farmer, 75 days? That's over 2 months. How can a farmer spend 2 months transporting his goods from one place to another? And that's just one route, and not even the most common route. Coastal shipping. Coastal shipping connected eastern seaboard cities. So if you could get to the coast, then you could have a shipping line take your goods from here to this coastal city, to this coastal city, to this coastal city. That's great. Really good shipping along the coast. But then, if you're a farmer in the West, just like, remember those corn farmers in western Pennsylvania? How do you get your produce over the mountains? It's as difficult in 1810, in 1820, as it was in 1793. The mountains are still there. As people moved west, there was more and more of a clamor for new roads and for states or governmental entities. I mean, what farmer could, build a road that would allow, you can't build a road from your farm to Pittsburgh. So as people moved west, more and more people clamored for improved roads, waterways, canals to transport products to markets. And so that they could also receive manufactured goods at reasonable prices. Now, tonight you can look at this map that gives you road and travel times. You'll be astonished at how long it took to get from place to place in 1800. And then steamboats. Steamboats were the first great blessing for farmers that lived west of the Mississippi, or even that lived east of the Mississippi, but west of the mountains, because river transportation, Mississippi River transportation is great, but as I'm sure you know, it only goes one way, right? The river flows from north to south. You cannot put cargo on the river in North Carolina and just let it move up to Minnesota. No, the river runs from north to south. So, river transportation is great if you're in the north and you want to go south, but if you've got to get something from the south, what are you going to do? So, fortunately, we have the steamboat. And the steamboat was invented and transformed river transportation. People could go up and down the Mississippi River. And then people realized, we really have quite a river system here, the Mississippi River, but also we have all of these rivers coming from the Mississippi and running to the Mississippi. Quite a river system in the eastern woodlands, and that was true. Look at any map. So people started thinking, you know, if we could connect this river to this town by a waterway, or this river to this river by a waterway, canals. Wow, wouldn't that be great? So, road building was the first big breakthrough in the transportation revolution. But it was very, very, very expensive. Canal building was the next big step in the transportation revolution. Now, everybody could see that building canals would terrifically facilitate farmers who wanted to sell their goods. It would terrifically facilitate the expansion of the market economy. And many people thought, therefore, that seems like a good project for the national government. Now, you and I would call canal building or building railroads, or we would call that building infrastructure. That's not what they called it. They called it internal improvements. And in the United States at that time, and through most of the 19th century, there were people in favor of the national government supporting internal improvements, and there were people opposed. Generally, the Republicans were opposed. So, and they were in greater number, so the national government did not build any canals. So state governments took on the expense of building canals. And look at this map. Look at the dozens of canals that fantastically facilitated transportation and therefore the growth of the market economy. Okay, I'll see you Wednesday.